A worn rubber flip-flop slid across polished marble and came to rest with a little skitter that sounded alarmingly loud in the bank's central hall. For a moment the air conditioning hummed like an indifferent chorus. Men in dark suits kept their gazes fixed on glossy brochures. A chandelier refracted the afternoon light into a pattern of brittle wealth across the floor. Sônia Maria dos Santos stood with her head bowed, one hand clutching a faded shopping bag, the other pressed to the strap of an old purse. Her Singer sewing machine lay waiting at home, its familiar rhythm and the smell of oiled metal and starch steadying her days. She had come to the bank to withdraw a small payment from her Social Security account, just enough to buy cotton and thread for the week's orders, to pay the electricity bill. Her hands, freckled and calloused, had steadied generations of seams. She understood ledger and measure in a tactile way the city's accountants never would. "Ma'am, you can't be here wearing that," said the manager, a man 20 years younger than her, immaculate tie catching the light. He smiled in the way people smile when they have power to spare and nowhere to invest it. "This is a premium branch. We have standards." It might have been a private reprimand murmured through a polite filter. Instead, in a voice calibrated for an audience, he added, "You're making people uncomfortable." A few behind him looked up to see what had caused the disturbance. One of the security guards, muscular, with an expression trained to deny, stepped forward as if on cue. Sonia's face did not flare with anger. She took as many small, careful steps as anyone with a lifetime of measured movements takes when shocked. The flip-flops were worn thin at the heel. The rubber had given to the warmth of years. A seam from one of her aprons did dangle, a thread that told of nights bent over cloth and a kettle that had boiled for the neighborhood's washing. She folded her shoulders as if to make herself smaller and more forgettable. Her lips formed a polite, apologetic sound. "I'm sorry." "You should leave," the manager said. He had the tone of someone reading from an etiquette manual that exempted him from human complexity. The guards moved their hands toward her elbow in a gesture that would later frame every camera angle and headline. "You can't take my card," Sônia said, turning. "It's my payment. I need it for—" The security guard, reciting the ritual of institutional removal, said, "Ma'am, you'll have to come with us to sort it out." His words were clinical. The act was not. Outside, the sunlight seemed to accuse rather than comfort. A neighbor took a photograph with a phone and uploaded it before the image had cooled. The photograph would multiply. Within hours it would be a tiny combustion of indignation across feeds. A senior woman escorted by guards, a smear of laughter circling like vultures around a wound. Back at home in Capão Redondo, the house smelled of coffee and fabric softener, of those small domestic economies that sustain families. The sewing table where Sônia worked was a shrine of practical art, spools of thread in a rainbow that had been dulled by repetition, scissors nicked from decades of use, a pair of reading glasses tinted by sun. Gabriella was there first, always impatient, hands quick, legs that had learned the city's shortcuts long before she had learned to trust paperwork. She had been the one to take the photograph, then to do what anyone does now, share it. Sonia's chest tightened. Her breath came in small pulls. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was the cumulative surrender of a body that had weathered years of labor. The neighborhood nurse who lived a block away arrived, insisting on water, checking pulses. "Maybe it's stress," she offered gently, although she had the experience to know the phrase could mean many things. In the kitchen, a pot of coffee had been left growing thin on the flame. When Marina walked in, the room paused. She carried a bag with a long strap and wore a practical coat, despite the heat. Her step was neither hurried nor unsteady. People who watch courtrooms on television have an image of judges' robes, black, heavy, cathedral-like. Marina did not move like that image. She had been named a substitute judge less than a year earlier, and had kept the news within the family at first. That role was a delicate instrument when you lived in a neighborhood where a dozen grudges could be leveraged into stories that ruin lives. She had learned discretion, not as strategy, but as necessity. Her face was composed, but not impersonal. She sat on the edge of the chair and took Sonia's hand in both of hers. "Mom," she said, and the syllable held a weight that rearranged the room. Gabriella was quick to stand in front of the conversation like a shield. "Are you all right?" she demanded of Marina. Sonia's hand trembled and then stilled beneath her daughter's. "They made a fuss about my shoes," she said, the words landing as if they were too large to carry. "They said I was dirty." Marina's eyes narrowed, not with anger but with calculation. To the outside world, she was just another woman in this cramped living room. Inside, she had the mind of someone trained to lay out arguments, to anticipate counterweights, to remember that a single comma in a text had ruined a life once. "Tell me everything," she said. The family circle tightened. They spoke over the kettle's hiss and the hum of a television set tuned to a muted football game. Sonia described the manager's voice, the way the guard's hand had found her elbow, the small comforts of the security guard's pretext, the suggestion she might be a risk to other customers. Gabriella's jaw clenched. She wanted to take a bus and find the men who had looked down and strike out a kind of street justice. Instead, Marina listened and made notes in a way that suggested plans rather than promises. "Are you hurt?" Marina asked, then added to herself, observing Sonia's pulse and the paleness of her hands. "We should get you to the clinic." Sonia shook her head. "I'm old," she said softly. "My chest is tight sometimes. It will pass." But the tightness remained. It was the sort that knotted when dignity had been stripped in public. Gabriella did not accept that calm. She called an ambulance. She called a neighbor who drove Sonia to the emergency room, where they talked to a clinician who ordered tests and insisted on observation for a night. There were small bureaucratic moments, a nurse clerking information, forms to sign, a plastic chair that squeaked. When the test said there was no immediate emergency, Marina sat on the hospital's cheap vinyl chair and took a breath that tasted of fried oil and disinfectant. She reached into her bag, touched the edges of a folded card, the one that explained her professional title in a formal way, and then, with a precise economy, said aloud, without the theatrical flourish of revelation, "I'm a judge, substitute judge. I have to know, did they take her card? Did they keep her money?" The revelation landed like a soft but decisive sound. Gabriella's reaction was instant and visible, a mixture of pride and worry that someone would leverage Marina's role for spectacle. "You should have told us," she said, but there was no reproach that cut deeper than relief. Marina's voice was flat for a moment, a judicial temperament applied to family. "I told you I would tell when it mattered." Then she squeezed Sonia's fingers. "This matters." That sentence shifted the story from a private hurt to a public problem. It reframed the event. A senior seamstress, escorted out of a bank, humiliated for the look of her shoes, was not simply the scandal of bad manners. It was an incident where power dynamics were on display, an intersection where the expectations of a polished financial space collided with the fragile dignity of a woman who had spent her life stitching the garments of others. They went home under a sky the color of old newsprint. Outside, Capão Redondo breathed as it always did. Children playing soccer in a dusty street, a dog barking at a parked taxi, a neighbor calling the name of someone across a fence. Inside the house, Sonia sat with a blanket over her knees and let the domestic light fall on the lines of her face. Marina opened her laptop. Gabriella paced, phone in hand, fingers already drafting the kinds of messages that seek the city's conscience. The photograph, the manager's face, the guard's badge number, if anyone had thought to record it. "What do you want to do?" Gabriella asked. Not as a rhetorical question, but like a soldier seeking orders. Marina breathed out slowly. She had options and responsibilities. The judiciary has a language, the measured procedural language of remedies and injunctions, but it is also a landscape of limits. You learn early that law alone does not always return dignity. There are hearings that are a litany of formality and appeals that drag like winter. Yet law can be an instrument that, when wielded properly, forces institutions to account. "We will ask for a formal apology," Marina said. "We will claim moral damages. We will seek to hold them accountable for their treatment of Mom." She paused, the words precise as if set by statute. "But we must be careful. The bank is connected. They are not small. They have influence that reaches into municipal offices." Gabriella's mouth hardened. "They won't buy us off," she said. A statement more of defiance than plan. Marina's hand found a pen and began to outline the first steps, a petition for urgent measures, an injunction, she wrote, noting for herself that the audience might need a plain word. An injunction is a court order to preserve a situation while the case proceeds, a request for the bank's internal records for that day, and a demand that the security footage be preserved. She knew that the visual record could be decisive. She also knew the risk. Institutions with means could erase a digital file or pressure a local security guard to alter his testimony. The family would need more than grief. They would need tactics. "Who will represent us?" Gabriella asked. Marina hesitated. The role of a sitting judge in a private case is precarious. She had to avoid conflicts of interest, avoid the very appearances that could compromise an eventual case. She would not be the public face of the litigation, but she could work behind the scenes, drafting, advising, pointing to strategy. It was safer, and it was honest. "That's why I called Figueiredo," she said. "He is experienced in civil matters and has handled cases against institutions before. He knows how to make a court worry about publicity costs." She glanced at the window, where children traced a path of light along a cracked sidewalk. "We need counsel who will treat this with seriousness." Dr. Figueiredo arrived at a small cafe on a humid afternoon, documents folded inside his briefcase. He was quick with his assessment. He smelled faintly of tobacco, like many people from his generation who had once smoked in corridors of power. He listened to Sonia's description, to the photograph, to Marina's clinical notes. He examined the receipt Sonia had held in her bag, the small record of a withdrawal that had taken place with patience and ordinary need. "This is actionable," he said finally. "They humiliated her. They failed in their duty as service providers. There are claims for damages, moral damages, compensation for humiliation. We can seek a declaratory sentence, a public apology, a fine, and, this is important, a court order preventing the bank from altering or destroying recordings and databases for the period around the incident." He explained the steps in the coffee shop's dim light as if folding them into a legal origami that would unfold in courtrooms and offices. A petition for immediate preservation of evidence, a formal complaint to the bank's ombudsman, which often begins an internal administrative record, and if necessary a lawsuit for indemnity. He warned them about the slow grind of law, about interlocutory orders and appeals, about the ways institutions sometimes use legal procedure itself to intimidate claimants. "We will prepare the request," he said, "but you should expect pushback. Wealth arrogates power. Banks have departments that think in press releases and in mitigation strategies." Marina listened and then, as if in a small aside, said, "They'll try to buy us. They always do." Dr. Figueiredo did not flinch. "They might," he said. "They'll test whether you value public principle over cash. That is part of the strategy. You must be prepared to refuse offers that would silence a greater claim." "Refuse offers?" The phrase sat between them like a moral marker. Gabriella's fingers tightened around her cup. Sonia stared at the table's grain and made a small private calculation about money. whether a lump sum could fix the shingles on the roof, whether a generous apology could be used to buy thread. The family's finances were not robust. There were choices that any practical person considers in the face of immediate need. But humiliation, Sônia said quietly, is not only about money. They mocked my shoes, she murmured. The sentence ricocheted, whether to accept a discreet settlement that would buy material comfort but exchange away public recognition of a wrong. Before they left the cafe, Marina placed a small audio recorder on the napkin. "If they try to buy us at a table," she said, "we record." The plan was simple, perhaps too simple for the scale of what waited. It relied on a basic human insight. Those who assume they have the upper hand speak freely, especially when they believe their money will solve whatever problem is posed. A recorded offer could change the case's rhythm, from one of he said, she said, to one of documentary weight. Word traveled in Capão Redondo the way neighborhoods still carry news. Quietly at first, by phone, then by murmured conversation across fences, then as a shared indignation on social pages. People who had Sonia's dresses sewn by hand arrived at the house with bowls of soup and stories of their own small humiliations. A retired municipal worker who kept an afternoon watch by a local church gave a short testimony about how the bank's branch had always been indifferent to older clients who needed more time. A teenage barista posted a short video of the photograph and asked, "Isn't this shameful? Enough attention to make the bank's social media team notice, enough attention to make the voice of indignation have echoes." Then the first formal contact from the bank arrived. A brief email from an associate at the legal department inviting the family to a meeting to clarify the events and assess possible accommodation measures. The language was professional, hedging around accountability with the language of corporate customer service. "You will not go alone," Gabriela said, fierce as a hawk. Marina's eyes measured 1,000 legal possibilities at once. She organized her thinking in an economy of precaution. "We will go," she said, "but we will not go into a private room. We will ask to be in a public area with witnesses, and we record the conversation." She tapped the recorder app on her phone, turned it on, then slid it into her pocket. She thought of the fragile equipment she kept in her desk drawer, recorders, flash drives, a second phone that was unused and kept for evidentiary reasons. The quiet, methodical accumulation of things that might matter later had become a private ritual. The meeting was set in a restaurant near the bank, a neutral place where managers felt comfortable and clients felt less certainly safe. Ricardo, the branch manager, arrived first, smiling with the kind of smile calibrated for crisis management. He wore a tie with small geometric shapes and the posture of someone who believed institutional power would cushion him from any moral consequences. With him was a slim man in a pressed suit who carried himself like a mediator. Dr. Peixoto, the bank's lawyer, along with a second assistant whose role was to witness, scribble, and keep the time tidy. The waiter brought water. The table's linen was overly crisp. Ricardo's opening line was practiced. "We're very sorry for the incident," he began, and the words were the smooth plaster of an apology that sought to seal a crack without addressing the foundation. "We'd like to offer a gesture of goodwill." He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check for an amount that in any ordinary life would be life-changing. The offer was accompanied by a rehearsed empathy. "We wish to avoid any public escalation," he said, voice pitched low, as if it were their mutual secret. Gabriela's hands flew. "You think you can pay us and make it disappear?" she asked, disbelief and fury braided tight. Ricardo's smile did not break. "This is a reasonable offer," he replied. "We prefer to resolve issues amicably." Marina reached for the envelope, fingers calm. She recorded the exchange, not for spectacle, but because documents and recordings often carry what memory forgets. "We will not accept hush money," she said simply. "We want accountability." The bank's lawyer adjusted his glasses. "There's a difference between a public apology and a private settlement," he said. "A settlement often includes a confidentiality clause." Marina did not need the lawyer to finish. She already understood how the clause read in the small print, silence in exchange for pecuniary relief. It was a contract that had long been used to tidy public reputation. "We're asking for the apology in public," she said, "and we want the footage preserved. We'll file a preservation request with the court, and we'll open a formal complaint as well." Their refusal would be the first true escalation. It would announce that this was no longer a gentle inconvenience a donor of corporate empathy could remedy over dessert. It meant a trial of documents and arguments, a slow-moving machine that could crush or repair, depending on the attention it received. Ricardo's jaw tightened for an instant, the slip of darkness people show when they sense their script is unraveling. He thanked them for their time and left with a politeness that was cold and mechanical. The check stayed on the table like a symbol of the bank's assumptions about what could be bought. They left the restaurant guardedly hopeful. They had done what they could with dignity intact. There was a victory in that alone. Refusal was itself a kind of civic stance. But Marina knew institutions had resources to pressure people who refused easy settlements. The bank's size meant it had lawyers who considered litigation a routine business cost. It had contacts. It had a media team and a network of security personnel who believed their training made them rule rather than servant. "It's not over," Marina said as they walked. "They will decide how far they want to push." A call that evening painted that push. Marina's line lit with an incoming number she did not recognize. The caller identified himself with careful formality. A municipal policeman, asking a few probing questions about a traffic complaint earlier in the afternoon. The questions were oddly precise about the timing of Marina's visit to the bank. He said he was simply ensuring the municipal databases were up to date and that nothing would impede an ongoing investigation. The words were bland. The intent, she felt, was not. "You should be careful," Gabriella said later, pacing the small kitchen like someone who stalked her agitation to exhaust it. "If they can mobilize cameras, they can mobilize people in power." Marina had expected pushback. She had not expected the first wave to look like routine municipal curiosity. She looked at Sônia, felt the decades that bent her mother's spine and the way the elder woman had withdrawn into a private dignity that made her family proud. Marina made another decision: prudence. She asked Figueiredo to prepare an urgent petition to preserve records and to file a complaint with the banking ombudsman immediately. She also reached out to a journalist she trusted, a reporter at a local paper who had covered consumer affairs and corruption, and who had a reputation for careful verification. Publicity, Marina thought, could be a protective measure. When a story has eyes on it, there is less room for quiet erasure. The petition was drafted in Marina's small handwriting at first, then formalized in Figueiredo's office. It described harm and demanded recognition. The legal language was technical and careful, a plea for declaratory relief and moral damages, a request for a preliminary injunction to prevent the destruction of evidence, a demand that the bank provide a public statement of responsibility while the suit proceeded. In a paragraph meant for the human reader rather than the statute book, Figueiredo wrote, "This case is not merely about money. It is about the dignity of a woman who contributed to this community for decades and was treated as if her worth could be measured by the rubber on her feet." The small phrase was catalytic. It circulated through social feeds and made its way into an online op-ed that posed a larger question. What does dignity cost in a city where appearances define access? The piece asked whether spaces of institutional privilege had the right to judge the artifacts of poverty. Within days, the bank responded not with contrition, but with an institutional statement that, in polished language, alleged a misunderstanding, and promised that an internal review would be conducted. It was the script of a corporation trained to show concern while keeping its positions protected. When the family went to the local police station to file an official complaint about the humiliation itself, sexual harassment, and public degradation in a space of business, they were met with the bureaucracy of forms and the wary gaze of attendants. The complaint was lodged, crisp and formal. It would later traverse channels and be reviewed and assigned numbers and perhaps ignored. Marina understood the arc. That is why she planned to use multiple levers: civil litigation, administrative complaints, media pressure. There was a late-night call from an old customer who confessed something small but telling. "They always treated us like we were nobody," she said. "But they never treated rich people like that. You must go after them." Her voice trembled on the line and then steadied. "Sônia gave me a dress for my wedding. She would never ask for money. She asks only to be seen." That testimony became part of a slow-building chorus. Neighbors came with small testimonies. The elderly man who had been ignored for an hour at another window, the mother with a child who had needed extra time and had been shushed, the teenage intern who swore he had seen a manager roll his eyes at a woman counting coins. Individually they were small, together they made a pattern. But power fights back. The bank's board convened. In an office with glass that looked down over something like the city's financial river, Dr. Arnaldo, the bank's founder and major shareholder, read the initial reports with a brow that tightened at the edges. He had built an institution that equated efficiency with purity. Any incident that suggested ethics had been broken offended him not simply as a business matter, but as a personal slight to the architecture of a company he had raised. "Settle quietly," he told his advisers. "We cannot let a petty complaint turn into a spectacle." But some managers are not content with quiet. The branch manager, Ricardo, nervously sent a series of texts seeking authorization to de-escalate by more than words. He did not understand that their refusal to accept hush money was not simply obstinacy, but the seed of a public fight that would test the bank's claim to moral competence. The next days were a study in escalation and counter-strategy. Marina arranged technical measures. She made backups of any recording she had. She stored files in multiple cloud accounts and on physical drives kept with trusted friends. She insisted on chain-of-custody protocols in their own home, in the language of people who know what is at stake when a file can disappear with a single power cut, or a single visit from authorities who identify themselves too quickly. What they did not know, what they could not know yet, was that the bank's reach extended into corners they had expected to be neutral. A person who had once served a short stint in the municipal force showed up at the door with an apparent concern for Sonia's welfare. "We've received reports," he said, in a voice meant to convey civic duty. He asked for details about who had visited that afternoon. His notebook was professional. His questions were precise. Marina felt a prickle of unease. The line between curiosity and harassment had thinned. Back in the living room that night, Sônia sat barefoot on the floor, fingering the hem of a blanket. Her hands trembled less from fear than from the exhaustion of being made visible. "My mother used to say," she murmured, "that when a person says you are nothing, the truth is that they are the one who feels small." Her daughters looked at her, and there was a complicated light. Love, worry, a resolve that would not let the moment be swallowed by quiet. They closed the windows and pulled the curtains. They placed flash drives in the small biscuit tin where, in old houses, people keep the things they never know how to name. The community's quiet solidarity persisted. A neighbor left a plate of food at the gate. A teenager posted a short video with the caption, "She is my neighbor. She sews for our whole family." The movement was still small, the social pressure only a breath of the potential storm, but momentum is an arithmetic of small acts. On the morning when the police officer called again, this time informing Marina that an old municipal warrant had surfaced for a minor administrative infraction linked to her name, the family felt the texture of intimidation. The offence was petty and technical. It had the shape of bureaucratic manufacture, an alleged irregularity in paperwork that, if not addressed, could produce an administrative burden. Marina stopped, absorbing the information, as if she were taking stock of a trail of breadcrumbs left on purpose. "Make a note in the file," she told Figueiredo when she called him. "We need everything in one place. If they try to escalate, we will have documentation." At the same time, the bank's internal threads were stirring. Ricardo, anxious and flanked by legal counsel, began to circulate a narrative in hushed tones. The family might be looking for money. The bank's default instinct was risk mitigation. Its first choice was to neutralize rather than confront, but neutralization requires consent, and consent had not been given. There are moments when small choices make a case more than statutes ever could. A young teller who had watched the scene in the bank and who felt the sting of not intervening handed a statement to Marina's counsel. "He mocked her shoes," the statement read. "I felt ashamed and I did nothing." The teller's testimony, though small, provided the shape of reality. Institutional arrogance often depends on bystanders shrugging. Evidence comes as witness after witness refuses to be silent. Marina folded each statement into the growing dossier with meticulous care. She typed, labeled, backed up. And then, one night, as the family gathered to eat a simple soup, Marina's phone chimed. An unknown number. A voice. The caller did not identify himself as a bank employee. He spoke slow and low. "You should stop," he said. "You are making powerful people uncomfortable. We can make this go away if you accept terms." The voice promised accommodation, and then delivered a thinly veiled threat. Legal complications, personal inconvenience, the suggestion that they could make the case very unpleasant for Marina in her professional role. Marina's reply was a controlled thing. "We will proceed with the complaint," she said. "We will not be bought." There was no bravado in her voice. Only the controlled cadence of someone aware that their next steps would determine not just a family's fate, but the credibility of an institutional claim. When the call ended, Gabriella clenched her fists in the way people do when adrenaline arrives without the fast release of action. Sônia, who had once patched the hem of a prom dress with the same hands that now held a bowl of soup, listened, and then said quietly, as if reciting a private litany, "They mocked my shoes. They will have to account for what that costs." Marina looked at her mother and recognized again why she had kept her role quiet. The judiciary has protocols for preserving distance. The family had needed that distance at first to protect Marina's position. Now, the judicial temperament and family courage were aligning. They would pursue the complaint not as a spectacle, but as a claim for recognition. They would press until the system, messy and imperfect, was compelled to answer. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening, lights coming on in windows, the distant rumble of buses. Capão Redondo folded into its nightly rhythms. A woman sweeping her stoop, a father whistling for a dog, children calling a neighbor for a late favor. Inside, files were printed, copies were made, an extra phone was placed in a locked drawer. The family rehearsed the story in small ways, not out of performative need, but so that witnesses would speak the same truth under the pressure of cross-examination. They were ready, or as ready as anyone can be when the opposition has a deeper pocket and broader reach. Yet readiness does not eliminate shock. There are infractions that a system tolerates until someone refuses the quiet accommodation. That refusal can prompt the system to respond with disproportionate force. A week after the restaurant meeting, while the family was still collecting witness statements, and while Figueiredo was preparing the initial petition, a squadron of municipal officers arrived at Gabriella's workplace. The timing was precise, unnerving. The officers came with the same polite insistence that had greeted the family's first days of complaint. They said there had been a complaint lodged against Gabriella, an administrative matter that required her to accompany them for questioning. Gabriella's colleagues crowded in the doorway and watched as she was led out, protests swallowed by the practicalities of procedure. Marina's stomach tightened. When Marina raced to the station, evidence of orchestration presented itself in small details, a report written with the sort of thoroughness usually reserved for complex cases rather than the petty administrative blips it alleged. She paced the hallways as a woman trained to measure steps by minutes. There were other officers, those she knew from municipal rotations, and their faces were unreadable. The station smelled of bleach and old coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed. Marina asked for access to the report and for legal counsel to speak with Gabriella. She made calls to Figueiredo, to the journalist, to a contact in the police ombudsman who might watch for impropriety. Her presence had an effect. Officers who had been matter-of-fact moments earlier now shifted with the awareness that someone with legal standing was watching. Something, she felt, had snapped loose. The bank's strategy was not simply to buy them or to ignore them. It was to pressure them into compliance by mobilizing systems that are supposed to be neutral: the law, the police, administrative processes. If Marina and her family were to persist, they would need not only evidence of what happened in the bank, but also proof of the campaign of intimidation. It was in that tense moment that a neighbor knocked at her office door with a USB drive. "I found this in the trash behind the restaurant," he said, his voice low. He had lived in the neighborhood for decades and knew when small scraps became important. "I thought it might be a recording." Inside, Marina plugged the USB into a cleaned laptop and scrolled through files. There were recordings of ordinary chatter at the restaurant, the clink of cutlery, fragments of the bank's conciliatory language, and, most devastatingly, a clear, unmistakable segment where an assistant at the table suggested a financial solution and in the same breath suggested the terms of silence. The voice was unmistakable. Polite, entitled, confident that money could backstop any moral inconvenience. Marina called Figueiredo with the discovery already burning in her speech. "We have it," she said. "We have the recorded offer." Her voice had the thin edge of relief and defiance. The evidence was not decisive by itself. Recordings can be challenged in the hands of experienced counsel. But it was something concrete, something that could not be easily rewritten. They made backups of the backup. They sent copies to the lawyer, to trusted media, to a contact at the Bar Association who had offered to watch for any attempts to intimidate legal counsel. The files multiplied their protection. And somewhere else, in a glassed office that looked out over a city, a message arrived and rippled through the bank's secure channels. A recording had leaked. The board's shoulders tightened. This was the moment when the story tilted from a personal humiliation to an institutional showdown. The flip-flop that had slipped on marble was no longer merely a symbol of poverty. It had become a trigger for a conflict between an ordinary life and the claims of a powerful institution. The family, for the first time in days, allowed themselves a sliver of hope, but hope was not naivete. They were aware that the other side would not fold neatly. They understood the law as both shelter and battlefield, an arena of procedure as well as principle. Sônia sat at a window later that afternoon, fingerprints of light crossing the table where her sewing remnants lay. Her hands, capable of mending, trembled as she smoothed a piece of cotton. "If they come for me," she said, more to the cloth than anyone else, "tell them I used to stitch the world together in small ways." Marina looked at her mother and steadied. She had no illusions about speed. Legal processes are slow, often glacial, and they rarely deliver poetic justice in a single ruling. But they also have the capacity to make institutions publicly answer for conduct that otherwise dissolves into private shame. That was the important calculus. They slept poorly that night. The files hummed on a server. The city moved in its habitual rhythms. The following day promised more visits, more paperwork, more attempts to sway. They were matched, not by the kind of money that could buy their silence, but by stubbornness, a family's insistence that the world recognize what had happened to one of its members. Outside, in the street where the song of Capon Redondo's market rose and fell, a child ran by with a new pair of shoes. The sunlight hit the rubber and the plastic, and for a fleeting second, everything seemed ordinary again. But ordinary could not stay in place. The bank's legal department, watching the ebb of media attention, convened and considered options not only for settlement but for countermeasures. Marina and Gabriela, armed with files and a recording and a growing chorus of neighborhood testimony, prepared for the next step. Formal filings, judicial notices, and the protective measures that would be needed if intimidation escalated. They moved with the steadiness of people who have to be careful, copying files twice, storing physical prints behind an old bookshelf, exchanging passwords in whispered codes. Then, a week after the leak of the recording, the story grew teeth. The recording had not simply exposed a bargain, it suggested a method. In boardrooms, a council spoken of reputational risk and escalation curves. In Capão Redondo, it became fodder for conversations in doorways and barbershops. For every person who sent a message of support to Sônia, there was another in a uniform taking cards and timelines and making notes. The bank's legal team moved fast, not with contrition now, but with a plan to apply pressure where it might hurt most, the bodies and routines of those who had refused its money. On a humid morning, Gabriela walked out of a small convenience store carrying a plastic bag of provisions and did not notice the plain white car idling near the corner. A pair of municipal officers stepped in front of her with an official politeness. They said her name, presented a thin sheet of paper that looked like a warrant, and asked her to come quietly. They would not say more than that. On live television, such scenes look chaotic. In real life, the choreography is quieter and more efficient. Marina received the call from a colleague while she was standing in the hallway of the courthouse. The word "detained" folded in on her. Her throat tightened. As a judge, she had seen how the coercive apparatus could be wielded. As a daughter, she felt the immediate, viscera-level violation. She raced to the station where Gabriela was being held. There were formalities. The officers read a list of alleged administrative infractions. An officer recited the procedures being followed. The claim on the paper was minor, an administrative irregularity, but the officers spoke with a firmness that indicated they intended to add teeth. A second brutality arrived that afternoon. Sonia's house was visited by men with official caps who said they were performing a search connected to an unrelated local complaint. They moved through her rooms with a clinical thoroughness that left a mess of drawers upturned and a scattering of the small domestic treasures she had kept for decades. Buttons sorted in jars, scraps of fabric, a medal the grandchildren had given her. No arrest followed that day, but the invasion itself had the sharpened effect the bank wanted. Terror made visible. The message was blunt. Refusal has costs. Marina, who had prepared for more than this, did not panic. She did demand counsel. She called Figueiredo. She called a contact at the Bar Association. She contacted a journalist who had been watching the case. The first action was legal, the second was public, the third tactical: keep the world looking. They filed complaints with the police ombudsman and with the Corregedoria, the internal affairs unit responsible for policing police. Corregedoria, explained in simpler terms for those outside Brazil, functions like an internal oversight body for law enforcement. The complaints were detailed and calm, cataloguing the timeline and including recordings, witness statements, and the USB drive that had been found in the trash behind the restaurant. Marina insisted on strict chain of custody. every file labeled, every hand that touched it noted. She had learned that systems of power often win by making evidence disappear. Meanwhile, the bank pushed back. They circulated alternative narratives, small, plausible insinuations that the family was seeking personal gain. They authorized an internal audit letter that claimed procedural compliance by staff. They placed a modest gift basket at the branch and called it a gesture of goodwill in drafts that never left the legal inbox. But outside, the conversation had shifted. The neighborhood's voices had multiplied, and a journalist's short piece had gone viral. Eyes from beyond their street began to watch. The morning Gabriella was taken to court for an administrative hearing, the prosecutor assigned to the small matter asked for a short adjournment. He said he needed time to examine evidence. The adjournment was the kind of delay that can feel like a threat. From the corner of a municipal building, a man in a suit photographed the proceedings and sent them to an anonymous contact. Marina watched all this like an experienced chess player measuring options. Then the escalation that nobody had fully predicted happened. Marina herself was taken from the parking lot of the court where she was stationed that morning. Plainclothes officers produced a document that alleged interference in an administrative process. An ironic twist for someone who, in her role as a substitute judge, had spent years protecting due process. She was handcuffed in the presence of passers-by. The images lit up feeds within hours. A woman in a judicial coat taken from her workplace led to a municipal vehicle. It was a classic pressure play, make the central figure appear compromised, and the public's sympathy might dim. The bank's strategy had moved beyond legal pressure into manufacture of institutional doubt. For a community watching, the scene felt like an act of aggression. For Marina, it was an affront that activated every legal tool she had been storing at home, like a hidden metal. Figueiredo and the Bar Association immediately intervened. They filed emergency petitions. They requested Marina's immediate access to counsel. They lodged complaints with the Corregidoria against the officers who had executed the arrest. They made public the timeline of the bank's earlier meeting and the recording. The journalist drafted an article laying out the documented sequence and asked, why had administrative interference claims been elevated to an arrest? In the police stations and in the bank's secure rooms, both, anxiety rose. The public side of the case had become unignorable. Yet the bank's operatives, sensing the walls close in, doubled down on a second move, the planting of evidence. That night the family home was visited again. This time, men came with the authority of an investigation. They placed items on the counter and later produced, in a municipal report, the claim that these items had been found in the kitchen and suggested illegal activity. There was no subtlety in the intention. If the family could be linked to petty or criminal acts, their moral claim might be weakened. Gabriella was moved from a holding cell to a larger lockup. The atmosphere there was a pressure cooker of small cruelties, bright lights, minimal beds, canned announcements through crude intercoms. She was frisked and questioned not only about the administrative issue, but about connections she had, about how the family had organized the recordings, about who had access to what. At one point, a thin-faced officer suggested in a voice that aimed to be casual, "You know, cooperating makes things easier." A phrase with multiple meanings. That sort of language is the currency of coercion. But the family had prepared. A secure copy of the recorded restaurant conversation had been lodged with a trusted journalist and with Figueiredo, whose phone was now constantly lit with messages. Marina's lawyers filed for habeas corpus on Gabriella's behalf and sought emergency review of Marina's own detention. They also filed for urgent intervention by the Corregidoria and requested a federal inquiry into the precinct where the arrests had originated, an appeal to an external and higher oversight to examine patterns of wrongdoing rather than isolated acts. This was the point at which the story required more than neighborhood support. It required institutions that could look back at the police themselves. The federal police, Policia Federal, were invited, formally, by a coalition of the Bar Association and a national journalist who had taken the case up and argued that there were signs of obstruction and possible crimes that crossed municipal boundaries. The federal police's involvement signaled a step-up. This was now not only a local scandal, but potentially an organized attempt to silence a family who had refused an institutional settlement. The federal investigators moved with the cautious force of people who know the legal risks of overreach. They opened files, issued subpoenas for communications between the bank and municipal officers, and, most critically, began to run digital forensic analysis on the USB drives and cloud backups the family had stored. The bank's IT systems were probed with a quiet thoroughness. Logs were requested, timestamps examined, deletion histories reconstructed. Sometimes a file's survival is not only what it says, but how it was handled. These details would matter. The discovery phase revealed several things. First, the allegedly lost security footage from the bank had not been overwritten, but had been duplicated and partially altered. Metadata showed attempts to change creation timestamps. Second, some municipal phone records indicated contact between unidentified bank consultants and officers who had been present at the family's house when the second visit occurred. Third, the restaurant recording's provenance was independently corroborated by the waiter's phone backups. Together, this lattice of facts formed more than suspicion. The federal team executed a search warrant at the precinct and at the home of a municipal officer. They seized devices and copies of communication logs. The image of federal agents in tactical vests moving through a municipal station was a reversal of power that the neighborhood had not seen before. At the precinct, they found notes, handwritten records of advice given to officers about how to handle complaints, materials that suggested operations designed to be plausible in form and cruel in function. Meanwhile, the public pressure was heating up. The journalist who had carried pieces of the recording published a detailed feature in which Figueiredo's timeline was laid out, and the Corregidoria's lack of immediate corrective action was questioned. Social media amplified the narrative. They mocked her flip-flops. They didn't know there was a judge in the family, became a refrain in comment threads. People left flowers at the gate of Sonia's house. A video of a neighbor describing a dozen small humiliations at the bank gathered hundreds of thousands of views. The story no longer belonged only to the family. It was a test case for many who felt the daily grind of institutional indifference. Faced with federal scrutiny and the prospect of a public relations meltdown, the bank's leadership made a tactical pivot. Rather than only deny, they opened a parallel channel of negotiation. This time, not with the family directly, but with a federal mediator and with the Bar Association as a witness. It was a classic containment maneuver. Try to shape the narrative as a conflict resolved through internal correction rather than one of systemic corruption. Dr. Arnaldo, the bank's proprietor, avoided public comment but allowed emissaries to talk. His notes, captured in seized emails, revealed worry about contagion, the idea that this scandal could inspire similar claims and disrupt investor confidence. Pressure, however, has its own friction. Inside the bank, not everyone moved with the same script. Ricardo, the branch manager, had been under enormous strain. The recording had his voice in the margins. The federal subpoenas had his communications in the open. When internal investigators asked him to sign a statement minimizing his role, he hesitated. Then, in a quiet office far from marble floors, he did something the company had not factored. He called a meeting with his counsel and Dr. Figueiredo's office and offered under oath and with a counseled confession a fuller account of events. It began as a small pivot, a branch manager who admitted to misjudgment. But under pressure from investigators who had his messages and the restaurant snippet playing on loop across devices, Ricardo's testimony changed courses. He described explicit instructions from higher-ups to manage the reputational risk and to consider offers for a quick resolution. He described the internal discussions that considered using municipal channels to intimidate the family if needed. In his statement, he named Dr. Peixoto, the bank's legal counsel, and, more consequentially, he described interactions with people who reported to Dr. Arnaldo. The confession was not only a moral reckoning, it was a juridical event. When Ricardo's signed declaration was delivered to the federal agents, the landscape changed quickly. Arrest warrants followed for several municipal officers suspected of fabricating complaints. Searches of bank executives' homes became legally authorized. Dr. Arnaldo received a summons and then, later, a formal detention order on charges including obstruction of justice and complicity in the manufacture of false evidence. Procedure simplified for narrative clarity. The initial reluctance of some senior bank staff to cooperate dimmed under the weight of documents and recordings that tied their in-house conversations to actions in municipal stations. The arrests were not cinematic. They were quiet, papered, careful. The news agencies ran images of luxury offices surrounded by police tape. The bank's stockholders demanded emergency meetings. For the family, the moment was both vindication and another complex beginning. Victory, they had learned, is not the end of labor. It is an invitation to responsibility. In the days that followed, prosecutors took statements and began constructing formal charges. The federal team's indictment described a pattern, a plan by bank agents to neutralize dissent through financial inducement, administrative harassment, and the manipulation of public agencies. It was a dense, technical document, full of timestamps and cross-referenced messages. But it also had a moral core, a claim that powerful institutions had attempted to silence citizens who refused to swap dignity for goods. Attention turned to the civil dimension. In the courthouse where Marina sometimes presided, the family's suit moved through the wheels of litigation with an intensity that felt almost theatrical. The bank counterclaimed, alleging defamation, but their legal posture had shifted. Now that federal prosecutors were pursuing criminal charges, the bank's defense strategy became defensive rather than aggressive. The courtroom scenes that followed were the kind of human theater that holds an audience with small gestures. Sônia testified. When she stood, the judge asked her to speak slowly. The microphone picked up the sound of a life measured in small mercies. "I used to mend wedding dresses," she told the court. "I sewed pockets into jackets for young men who couldn't afford to have them. I have hands that know how to fix." She described the day at the bank without theatrics. The smell of the marble, the manager's laugh, the guard's polite command, and with a clarity that had the room leaning in. "What they took from me was the feeling that I mattered," she said. "Not for money, but as a person." The gallery was full, neighbors who had come to support her, the journalist who had covered the recordings, students of law who wanted to learn from the procedural interplay of public and private power. Dr. Figueiredo cross-examined bank witnesses with a surgical calm, his questions designed to reveal contradictions in their earlier statements. When he played the restaurant recording, the room's atmosphere shifted. Silence is a kind of testimony. The recorded voices, dry, polite, entitled, filled the air like a confession. Ricardo provided a crucial moment on the witness stand. His voice trembled a bit as he recounted the pressure he felt from above and the meetings he had attended. He described, without theatricality, the calculation of risk. When an institution treats reputation as a ledger, people begin to be seen as expenses. He answered questions candidly and, at points, with regret. The defense attempted to minimize errors in judgment, they said, no coordinated plan. But the forensic metadata and the notes seized at the municipal station told a different story, a sequence that had been plotted and then executed by people who believed the normal rules did not apply to them. The court did its work, weighing testimony, examining documents, listening to the rhythm of evidence. Outside, the public watched and discussed. The phrase from social media, "They mocked her flip-flops, they didn't know the law was walking behind them," appeared on placards in informal protests and in commentaries. For many, it was a shorthand for a deeper idea. Dignity has social consequence. Humiliation is not a private matter. The trial moved forward over months. There were hearings about evidence admissibility, arguments about chain of custody, and technical debates about the legality of certain searches. Throughout, Marina kept her role clear. She had not publicly presided over her family's case. She had been careful to avoid conflicts, but privately, she had been instrumental in assembling evidence and ensuring that every procedural requirement was met so the case could not be thrown out on a technicality. The law, she believed, could not be a showpiece. It had to be a ladder. When the criminal proceedings culminated in plea deals and trials, some individuals accepted responsibility and entered negotiated pleas. Others contested the charges. Dr. Arnaldo was indicted on several counts and, under increasing evidence of his involvement, was arrested and brought to trial. The prosecution presented a narrative that connected the dots, a bank culture that used both money and municipal instruments to silence a complaint. The confession of a branch manager, the forensic record of altered files, the planted evidence at the family home, and the municipal officers who had executed the intimidation. The sentencing hearings were quiet affairs, relative to the public attention but seismic for those involved. The court considered not only criminal culpability, but the social message of the acts. Judges have in their hands the capacity to name harms beyond transactional injuries. The sentences read sought to address both punishment and deterrence. Fines, probation, and custodial sentences were imposed where applicable. Importantly, the bank was ordered to pay compensation for moral damages to Sônia and to fund community programs as part of a restorative measure. The orders required the preservation of certain practices within the bank, training for staff on elder treatment, transparency measures, and the publication of a public apology. The civil suit's verdict, rendered after painstaking testimony and written submissions, declared that the bank had violated Sônia's dignity and had engaged in practices that warranted public recognition and reparations. The judge's written opinion used language that, while technical, also acknowledged the human stakes. Institutions must not treat people as expendable. The indemnity awarded was significant enough to change the family's economic horizon, but not so large as to erase the moral importance of the case. There were no cinematic triumphs, no sudden proclamations from a balcony. There was instead a careful juristic closure, a verdict, a sentence, a public apology printed in newspapers and posted on the bank's website. The apology read with the formality of corporate language, but was accompanied by other concrete obligations that the family and their counsel had insisted on. The bank would fund an elder rights information center in Capão Redondo for 3 years. The bank was to sponsor training programs for their staff on empathy and inclusion, and the bank would fund a modest seed donation to a new community institute the family intended to found. These practical outcomes mattered. The family did not take the money as revenge. They had insisted during negotiation that any sizable award should be used to create something that extended beyond them. That principle guided what came next. With the indemnity funds and a mixture of donations from citizens who had followed the case, the family, led by Gabriela and Gabriela's friends along with the guidance of Marina and Figueiredo, founded the Instituto Sônia Maria. Its mission was humble and precise, to provide legal aid for elders, to offer sewing and micro-enterprise workshops, and to create a neighborhood watch platform that trained volunteers in documenting mistreatment and preserving evidence. The Institute's office was in a renovated room next to the old sewing table. The walls were painted bright, the windows open to the street where neighbors could see the daily work. Sônia, for her part, resumed sewing. But now the singer sat on a sturdier table, and there were new jars of thread. She taught a small class twice a week, grandmothers and young mothers, people who wanted to learn a trade and a voice. Her hands moved with the same assuredness as before, but there was a new audience around her, people who came not only for the hem, but for the presence that such hands gave to a community. And the neighborhood responded. The inauguration of the Institute was a modest festival. A band from a nearby church played under string lights. Children chased one another in the yard. Neighbors brought platters of food. There were speeches, some formal, others halting and intimate, thanking the family for their courage. Marina, who remained a judge and returned to the bench with the quiet integrity she had always held, stood near the doorway and watched the faces of people reclaiming space. Gabriella, who had once imagined street justice as the first response, now worked the door as an organizer, teaching new volunteers how to document abuse and how to call the correct authorities without fear. In the months that followed, the Institute hosted legal clinics, pro bono lawyers giving short consultations, sewing classes that helped women launch small home businesses, and informational sessions about citizens' rights in public spaces. People who had felt anonymous now had a place to speak where they would be heard. The seed of community empowerment had begun to sprout. The bank, chastened publicly and undergoing internal reforms, published a series of training modules and established an ombudsman office with independent oversight. Whether those changes would prove deep or superficial would be a test of the institution's character in the years to come. For the family and the neighborhood, the immediate change was material. Roofs mended, a refurbished storefront, and a legal hotline. As for Ricardo, he took on work outside of banking. He apologized publicly, attended community meetings, and testified in other cases as a witness for the prosecution, where his participation could shine light on patterns of corporate behavior. It was not a redemption that erased harm, but a small realignment of responsibility. And Dr. Arnaldo, he faced legal consequences and the loss of a reputation he valued as currency. He delivered a statement in court, clinical in tone, which acknowledged error and promised institutional review. For many in the neighborhood, his words were not enough. The sentences and the orders mattered more. The law had, in the end, acted. The final courtroom scene, the sentencing for those found criminally culpable, was not dramatic in soundtrack. The judge read the penalties in a voice that balanced measured law and moral clarity. "Dignity," the judge wrote, "is not a commodity through which one may trade." The sentence included, among other things, an order that explicit training be mandatory for staff engaging with vulnerable clients. When all the legal dust settled, the family's life was not perfectly restored to a pre-incident nostalgia. The invasions and arrests had left marks, memories that caught in quiet moments, nights when a jar of buttons looked too bright with what it had survived. But there was also a restored sense of worth and a public recognition that mattered for the elderly in the barrio who had watched in silence for too long. The Institute became a place where Sônia sat in a chair by the window, and the sunlight caught the weave of her new white flip-flops, purchased not as a symbol of bought victory, but as a small comfort. Children ran through the yard of the Institute. A neighbor who had been embarrassed to speak months earlier now registered for a legal clinic. A young woman who had watched the case online enrolled in a sewing course and learned to stitch a hem with the same steady hands that had mended so many garments. Marina returned to her work on the bench with a renewed sense of what the judiciary could be when it was both precise and compassionate. Sometimes she would visit the Institute, always as a private daughter, not as a magistrate. People would greet her with a mixture of reverence and the warmth of familiarity. She remained careful about the boundaries of her role. She continued to teach the young lawyers who often volunteered at the Institute that justice was both a procedure and an ethic. There were small side stories that filled the months. A retired municipal worker who took sewing lessons and mended a uniform. A teller who had signed a testimony and later quit the bank, opening a small kiosk selling pastries. An intern who, emboldened by what she had seen, sought a job in public accountability. The ripples of one family's refusal to be bought spread outwards. The last public act that marked the end of the legal chapter was not a parade, but a quiet moment in a small courtroom, the reading of the final civil judgment and the formal deposit of funds into the Institute's account. Sônia sat in the gallery, hands folded, a neighbor at her side. When the judge finished, the courtroom felt like a measured breath. The family stepped out into the light and walked home through the street where children played soccer and a dog slept in the shade. A woman shouted from a stoop, "Sônia, come to the barbecue this Sunday." People clapped. A man raised his palm in a salute that was almost a benediction. At the Institute, months later, there was a celebration of small victories. Sônia cut a ribbon that proved not about wealth, but about continuity. The sewing machines hummed. A line of new flip-flops, simple white, sat on a table near the doorway, gifts for the elders who came to a morning circle. The neighborhood choir sang, off-key and joyful, while neighbors danced in a way that acknowledged suffering and refused to be defined by it. On a quiet evening, as the festival dwindled and the streetlights came on like slow candles, Marina stood with her mother on the Institute's little stoop. Sônia looked down at her shoes, the new flip-flops, the bright, clean rubber, and then at the street where people still moved as they always had. Marina's hand found hers, steady and warm, and the two of them watched the neighborhood. "They mocked your shoes," Marina said softly. "They had no idea what walked behind them." Sônia smiled, the smile of a woman who had mended shirts and lives and, in the end, helped mend a city. "No," she said, "but now they do." If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more stories of courage and community. Share it with someone who believes dignity has no price. There remained work to do. The Institute would need continuing support. Advocacy in other neighborhoods would require staff, and the reforms at the bank would need monitoring to ensure they were not window dressing. The family knew this. Justice, they had learned, is less a final event than an ongoing responsibility. Years later, a small plaque on the Institute's wall bore the name Instituto Sônia Maria. It was not ostentatious, only a small metal plate with letters trimmed in black. Underneath, they placed a quote that had been spoken by a neighbor during those early days. "Dignity has no price." Visitors would read it and then look at the sewing machines and at the white flip-flops near the door, and understand that a single morning in a bank had become the start of something larger. The city continued to turn. People still judged others by shoes in taxis and cafes, and institutions still had the power to wound. But in a small corner of Capão Redondo, a seamstress and her daughters had turned humiliation into law, and law into community resource. The flip-flops, once a reason to laugh, became a quiet symbol of resistance. Those who had mocked Sônia's shoes had not known the law was walking behind them. They had not known the steady, patient accumulation of papers and recordings and witnesses. They had not measured the force of a neighborhood prepared to stand together. In the end, the smallest item of dress had exposed the larger fabric of responsibility. Sônia kept sewing. The singer hummed like a steady heart. Children learned to stitch, and with their stitches learned to hold together the world in small, persistent acts. The Institute's door was always open to people who needed advice or an honest conversation. In the evenings, neighbors sat under the eaves, sharing empanadas and stories. The city had not been remade, but a piece of it had been repaired. Justice had been slow, imperfect, and insisted upon. It had required courage, legal care, and the insistence that dignity be recognized. The family had paid a cost in nights of worry and in the tremors of memory. Yet their response, refusing hush money, gathering evidence, trusting institutions where they could, and building a community resource when their case closed, became a kind of answer to the humiliation. They mocked her mother's flip-flops, not knowing her daughter was a judge. But what they had truly underestimated was that the family did not carry only one form of authority. They carried law, yes, but they also carried neighborliness, history, and the simple crafts of people who mend things. Those things held weight. When the light over Capon Redondo grew soft, and Sonia sat with her hands on a new piece of cloth, she glanced at her white flip-flops by the chair, and then at Marina, who had returned to her bench, and at Gabriela, who was teaching a class in the Institute's yard. The world, she knew, would still present cruelties, but for now, in the soft domestic light, the measure of what had been reclaimed felt full. If you believe dignity has no price, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and consider supporting local community initiatives that protect the elderly and teach legal rights.